It stands in the Muskoka District of Ontario, set back from the shore of a lake so still in the early morning that the reflection of the building doubles itself in the water below. White clapboard. Long verandas running the full length of each pavilion, open to the air on three sides. The surrounding forest is the deep, dark green of northern Ontario pine, pressing in close on both sides. And through it, when the wind drops, you can hear the lake. The whole scene has the composed, slightly too perfect quality of a postcard, the kind sent home to prove that a place is everything that was promised. In the winter of 1903, a 23-year-old dressmaker from Toronto named Clara Hodgson arrived here after 11 months on a charity waiting list. She had tuberculosis. She had been told the Muskoka Free Hospital for Consumptives would give her a fighting chance. She was assigned to the open-air veranda on the second floor of the main pavilion. The temperature that February fell to 14 degrees below zero. She developed pleurisy within 12 days. She died on the veranda on February 19th. The hospital's annual report categorized her death under advanced cases. Little hope on admission. That spring, her photograph, taken during her final weeks without her family's knowledge, appeared in the institution's fundraising circular. Her mother found out when a neighbor brought the pamphlet to her door. This was the Muskoka Free Hospital for Consumptives, opened in 1897 to save the dying poor of Ontario from tuberculosis, funded by the charitable donations of thousands of Canadians who believed the word free meant exactly what it said. This is not just the story of one sanatorium. This is the story of what happens when dying people become an asset, and the people managing that asset have no one watching them. If you're drawn to the histories that charitable institutions would prefer remain unexamined, you're welcome to subscribe and keep exploring with me. To understand what the Muskoka Free Hospital became, you must first understand the disease that built it. By the 1890s, tuberculosis was killing more Canadians than any other single disease. In the cities, Toronto, Montreal, Hamilton, the death rate from consumption, as it was commonly called, ran to roughly 200 per 100,000 people per year. In the tenement districts, in the factory neighborhoods, among the working poor who lived in overcrowded rooms without adequate ventilation or nutrition, the rate was considerably higher. A disease that spread through the air moved with devastating efficiency through the cramped quarters of industrial-era poverty. The medical science of the era had recently established, through the work of Robert Koch in 1882, that tuberculosis was caused by a bacterium, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. This was a genuine scientific breakthrough. It meant that consumption was not, as had previously been believed, the product of hereditary weakness or moral failing. It was an infectious disease. It could, in theory, be understood and controlled. What it could not yet be in 1897 was cured. There was no antibiotic. There would not be one until streptomycin arrived in 1943. What the medicine of the 1890s offered instead was a theory: the rest cure, the sanatorium cure. The idea, developed primarily in Germany and Switzerland, and applied with evangelical fervor throughout North America and Britain, that tuberculosis could be arrested, if not cured, then held, through a specific regimen. Clean mountain air, complete physical rest, structured nutrition, the removal of the patient from the exhausting, overcrowded, bacterium-laden environment of the industrial city, and their placement in a clean, ordered, outdoor-facing institution in the countryside. It was a theory. It was not well evidenced. And in the specific context of Ontario's winters, where temperatures in Muskoka regularly fell below 0 Fahrenheit and patients were kept on open-air verandas as part of the cure, it was a theory that was actively dangerous to the advanced cases that the free hospital was specifically designed to receive. The men who built the Muskoka Sanatorium system believed the theory. Most of them believed it sincerely. But sincerity, in the institutional history of the free hospital, is not the most interesting part of the story. The money is. And the money was already being arranged before the first patient ever arrived. The man who built the Muskoka Sanatorium system, who designed its structure, recruited its board, wrote its fundraising literature, and gave it its name, was not a physician. He was a Toronto businessman named William Gage. Gage had made his fortune in the stationery trade. He was a publisher of school textbooks. He was a prominent member of the Methodist Church. He sat on the boards of Toronto's leading charitable institutions. He was, by any measure that the era applied to philanthropy, and son's exemplary citizen, the kind of man whose portrait hung in institutional corridors and whose death notices ran to 3 columns in the newspaper. He had also buried a brother to tuberculosis. The loss was genuine. The grief was real. In the early 1890s, when the sanatorium movement was gaining momentum across Europe and beginning to find advocates in Ontario's medical establishment, Gage threw himself into the project of bringing it to Canada with the energy of a man who believed he was fighting a battle he had already lost once and was determined not to lose again. He founded the National Sanatorium Association in 1896. He recruited to its board the names that mattered in Toronto: businessmen, clergymen, physicians, the kind of men whose involvement in a charitable project was itself an endorsement. He organized the public campaign. He wrote the letters to the press. He raised the initial funds. The Muskoka Cottage Sanatorium, for paying patients, opened on July 14, 1897. The Muskoka Free Hospital for Consumptives, for the poor, for those who could not afford the cottage rates, opened 11 days later, on July 25, 1897. The 2 institutions shared a board. They shared an administrator. They shared an address on the edge of Gravenhurst. They were presented to the public in all of Gage's fundraising literature as a unified philanthropic project, the paying sanatorium funding the free one, the charity and the commerce working in tandem for the public good. What they did not share, in practice, was equal resources, equal staffing, equal accommodations, equal access to the most medically attentive care. Those distinctions were not mentioned in the fundraising literature. The National Sanitarium Association was never prosecuted for what the 1909 audit would document. It continued to receive charitable donations from Ontario's public for another 2 decades. Gage was awarded an honorary degree by the University of Toronto. He died in 1921 as one of the most celebrated philanthropists in Ontario history. There is one detail from the founding of the Free Hospital that deserves to be preserved here, because it appears in Gage's own correspondence in the Ontario archives and tells you something that the fundraising circulars never quite managed to say. In a letter to a potential donor, written in the spring of 1897, Gage described the Free Hospital's intended patient population as those in the early and curable stages of consumption, who, lacking resources, are compelled to remain in the city and so progress to the incurable stage. The institution, he wrote, would catch them early, give them the cure before it was too late. The admission records of the Free Hospital's first decade tell a different story. A significant portion of its patients were advanced cases. Many were admitted in what the institution's own physicians described in internal correspondence as the terminal phase. They had waited too long on the charity list. They had progressed. They were treated on the veranda regardless. The Muskoka Free Hospital for Consumptives was not built to dazzle. It was built to demonstrate. It demonstrated to every journalist who came to write about it, and every politician who came to inspect it, and every donor who came to feel good about their contribution, that modern medical science could be made accessible to the poor, that charity and progress could work together, that Ontario was a civilized province. The main pavilion rose 2 stories above the lakeshore, white painted wood with a green tin roof that caught the light on summer mornings. The verandas, the institutional centerpiece, the architectural argument for the cure, ran the full length of the building on both floors, open on 3 sides to the northern Ontario air. In summer, they were beautiful. Hammered into the pine forest above a lake that reflected the sky in 2 directions, the verandas offered a view that genuinely looked like recovery, like the world getting cleaner and simpler and more possible. The beds were lined up along the veranda walls in all seasons. The patients lay in them, bundled in blankets against the cold in the months from October through April, and breathed the northern air that was supposed to be killing the bacteria in their lungs. They rested. They ate the structured meals the institution provided. They did not exert themselves. This was the cure. The interior of the main pavilion had a dining hall, a small reading room, and a chapel. The walls were painted white. The floors were scrubbed wood. It was clean, by the standards of the era. And clean was itself a form of statement, a contrast to the tenement rooms most of these patients had come from, where walls were dark and air was shared by too many people in too little space. The doctor's office occupied a corner room on the ground floor, with a window facing the lake. It was a room designed to convey medical authority, a desk, a cabinet, of instruments, the ordered filing of case notes. The physician who sat behind that desk was the sole clinical authority for the entire institution. His word was the last word on every admission, every treatment decision, every classification that determined whether a patient was considered curable or incurable. And the classification mattered, because the institution's fundraising literature promised donors that it was saving the curable, and the patients dying on the veranda in February had been told they were curable. Both things could not be simultaneously true. There is one detail embedded in the architectural record of the Free Hospital that means something different by the end of this story than it does here. The verandas were described in the architectural plans submitted to the National Sanatorium Association's board in 1896 as the therapeutic core of the institution, the mechanism by which the curative properties of the northern climate will be delivered to the patient. They were the selling point, the thing that distinguished this institution from the city hospitals where consumption patients went to die in crowded wards. They could not know, or some of them could, and simply chose not to say, that for patients with advanced pulmonary disease admitted in November, the veranda's northern exposure and the specific meteorological conditions of Muskoka in winter would function not as medicine, but as accelerant. In its first years, the Muskoka Free Hospital functioned approximately as its founders had described, or at least closely enough that the annual reports could be written without too many qualifications. The early patient population included a proportion of genuinely early-stage cases who arrived in summer and spent their months in the specific beauty of the Muskoka shoreline, resting, eating, breathing the air, and in some cases improving enough to return to their lives. These recoveries were documented with care. They appeared prominently in the annual reports. They appeared prominently in the fundraising circulars. The summers in Muskoka were, in those early years, something a patient might genuinely have described as restorative. The lake in the mornings, the stillness of the pine forest, the veranda in the long light of a northern Ontario afternoon, warm and clean-scented, with the sound of birdsong and the occasional splash of a canoe on the water below. The donors who came to visit in July, and the association encouraged donors to visit, saw this. They saw patients sitting up, reading letters, taking meals in the fresh air. They saw the white paint and the scrubbed floors. They wrote their checks. They did not come in February. In February, the lake was frozen. The veranda was open to winds that came off Georgian Bay. The temperature dropped to levels that would have closed a construction site. The patients in the advanced case beds were wrapped in blankets that were never quite enough and breathed air so cold it could be seen. And they coughed into that air, and what they coughed up was red. And the nurse on duty recorded it and moved to the next bed. The annual report for those months used the same language as the annual report for July, the same optimism, the same confidence in the therapeutic properties of the northern climate. But the world outside the institution was changing in ways that would soon make certain things harder to ignore. By 1905, scientific literature from European sanatoria, particularly from Germany, where the Sanatorium movement had originated, and where its methods were being most rigorously tested, was beginning to qualify the enthusiastic claims of the cure's earliest advocates. The fresh air regimen showed genuine benefit for early-stage cases in moderate climates, for advanced cases, for the indigent patients who arrived in winter after months on a waiting list. The evidence was considerably thinner. The physicians associated with the National Sanatorium Association read this literature. They subscribed to the journals. They attended the conferences. The annual reports continued to describe the therapeutic properties of the Northern Ontario winter. By 1906, the physical expansion of the Muskoka institutions had produced a geography that told the story the annual reports would not. The Muskoka Cottage Sanatorium, the paying institution, occupied the better buildings. It had newer construction, more private accommodations, a higher ratio of nursing staff to patients, and access to the most experienced physicians on the association's roster. Its patients paid rates that ranged from $7 to $15 per week, depending on the accommodation level. And for that money, they received an institution that resembled, in certain respects, a resort. The same lake view, the same pine forest, but with individual rooms and proper heating in the sleeping quarters. The free hospital sat adjacent. Same lake, same forest. Closer to the shoreline, which meant more exposed to the winter wind. Its buildings were older. Its staffing ratios were lower. Its patients paid nothing and received, in several measurable respects, less. The distinction was not a secret. It appeared in the architecture. It appeared in the staffing schedules. It appeared in the patient mortality statistics, which showed consistently higher rates at the free hospital than at the paying institution. A gap that the board attributed, in its internal discussions, to the fact that the free hospital necessarily received the sicker patients. Those who had waited longer, those who arrived more advanced. This was true. It was also incomplete. Because the free hospital received sicker patients, in part because the system had been designed in a way that ensured it would, the early-stage curable cases that Gage's founding letter described as the institution's target population were precisely the cases most likely to be able to afford the cottage sanatorium's rates, or to qualify for a sliding scale arrangement, or to have a church or employer willing to contribute to the cost of private care. The free hospital got what was left. It had been getting what was left since 1897, and it had been telling donors since 1897 that what was left was what it was built to save. The 1909 board meeting that discussed the financial audit was described in the surviving record as routine quarterly business. The word audit does not appear in the public minutes. The transformation of the free hospital from a flawed but genuine charitable effort into something more systematically dishonest did not happen in a single year. It accumulated, as institutional deceptions tend to, through the compounding of small decisions made by men who were, individually, convinced that what they were doing was necessary. The charitable donations collected in the name of the free hospital funded, by the early 1900s, not only the free hospital's operations, but a portion of the broader National Sanitarium Association's administrative costs that included the management of the paying cottage sanatorium. The accounting had never been clean. The two institutions shared overhead, shared staff, shared equipment. Some degree of cross-subsidy was structural and arguably unavoidable. What the 1909 audit documented was something beyond structural, a deliberate transfer of funds raised explicitly for the care of indigent consumptives to offset the cottage sanatorium's operating deficit during a period when its occupancy rates had declined and its revenues had fallen short of expenses. The amount transferred was not trivial. The donors who had given to save the poor had, without their knowledge, saved a business. The board received the audit. The board discussed it. The board sealed the minutes. What happened next was not a public reckoning. It was a fundraising campaign. Within 8 months of the sealed audit, the National Sanitarium Association ran its annual spring appeal. The circular described the free hospital's work in terms that were, in light of the audit, a kind of sustained fiction. It described the institution's commitment to the poor consumptive. It included the photographs of patients, some of them, like Clara, taken without family consent, during the final weeks of their lives. It included the mortality statistics, framed in a way that made the deaths evidence of the institution's importance, rather than evidence of its failures. It raised more money than the previous year's campaign. At the center of all of this, from the association's founding through the decades that followed, was one man whose role in what the institution became deserves to be looked at directly. Dr. James Moorhead arrived as the Free Hospital's medical superintendent in 1901. He had trained in internal medicine in Toronto and had spent 2 years at a German sanatorium studying the rest cure under its most prominent European advocates. He returned to Ontario with complete conviction in the method and with a professional manner that made conviction feel like certainty. He was a member of the Canadian Medical Association. He published in the Canadian Lancet. He presented at the annual meetings of the Ontario Medical Association on the Sanatorium cure's results in the Muskoka climate. He was consulted by the Ontario government on provincial tuberculosis policy. His opinion carried the weight that comes with credentials, publication, and the specific confidence of a man who has never been seriously challenged. He was, in the professional estimation of everyone who dealt with him, the foremost authority on sanatorium medicine in Ontario. His patients were being placed on open verandas in February on his clinical authority. He knew the temperatures. He read the European literature that was beginning to qualify the cure's claims for advanced cases in cold climates. He continued to order the veranda regimen. He continued to classify patients as curable who were not curable, because curable patients were what the fundraising literature promised, and curable patients were what the board expected him to admit. He believed he was advancing medicine. He wrote that, in his correspondence and in his published papers, in terms that leave no room for irony. He believed the fresh air method was the best available science. He believed that the mortality statistics were explained entirely by the advanced state of the cases the Free Hospital received, not by the treatment. What he did not publish, what did not appear in any of his papers in the Canadian Lancet, was that the classification decisions he made about which patients were admitted and under what designation were shaped by considerations that had nothing to do with clinical medicine. The board wanted curable patients admitted to the Free Hospital. Curable patients produced better fundraising statistics. The classification served the institution. The science behind the sanatorium cure, the specific claim that placing a consumptive patient in the Northern Ontario open air in all seasons for extended periods of bed rest would arrest or reverse the progress of their disease, was not, even by 1905, as well established as its advocates presented it. The foundational evidence came from European sanatoria in the Swiss and German Alps, where the altitude, the climate, and the specific patient population, largely middle-class patients with early-stage disease, well-nourished, with the resources to remain at a sanatorium for a year or more, produced results that the institution's promoters extrapolated to every setting and every patient population without much scrutiny of whether those conditions held. In Muskoka, they did not fully hold. The altitude was wrong. The Muskoka District sits at roughly 1,100 feet above sea level, a fraction of the Swiss sanatorium altitude where much of the foundational evidence had been gathered. The patient population at the Free Hospital was wrong. Malnourished, advanced case, working-class patients who had spent years in the exact conditions of urban poverty and crowding that had made them most susceptible to the disease in the first place. The winter temperatures were wrong, not the crisp, dry cold of the alpine cure, but the wet, penetrating cold of a Canadian Shield winter that exacerbated the respiratory inflammation of tuberculosis, rather than reducing it. The physicians of the National Sanitarium Association knew this literature existed. Dr. Moorhead cited some of it in his own published work, selectively, in the way that a man who has committed to a position cites the evidence that supports him and brackets the evidence that does not. The patients trusted him. Their families trusted the institution. They had no framework within which to evaluate the discrepancy between what the sanatorium promised and what the Ontario winter delivered. The mortality rate at the Free Hospital in the months of December through March was, in the years between 1900 and 1915, consistently higher than the mortality rate during the summer months. This pattern appeared in the institution's own records. It was never the subject of a published clinical analysis. It was never the subject of a public inquiry. But numbers, even these numbers, can become abstract. Some of the patients who died here had names. Numbers, even horrifying numbers, can become abstract. So let us remember two of them. Clara Hodgson was 23 years old in the winter of 1903 when she arrived at the Muskoka Free Hospital for Consumptives. She was a dressmaker. She had worked for a tailoring establishment on King Street West in Toronto for 4 years and had sent a portion of every week's wages home to her mother in Hamilton. She sewed precisely and quickly. Her employer described her, in a letter written to support her application to the Free Hospital, as the most reliable worker he had employed in 12 years. She had been coughing blood since the previous spring. She had applied to the Free Hospital in March of 1902. She waited 11 months. She arrived in February. She was assigned to the second-floor veranda. Her case was classified by Dr. Moorhead on admission as moderately advanced, a designation that, in the institution's internal classification system, placed her in the curable category and made her eligible for the program of rest, fresh air, and structured nutrition that the Free Hospital offered its charity patients. She was placed on the veranda in temperatures that the Gravenhurst weather records for February 1903 show averaged 7 degrees Fahrenheit during her first 2 weeks. She developed pleuritis, inflammation of the membrane surrounding the lung, within 12 days of her arrival. The pleuritis was recorded in her case notes by the attending physician. The veranda regimen was not modified. She died on February 19th. She was on the veranda when she died. The attending nurse's note records that she was found at the 6 a.m. check, her blankets around her, her face turned toward the lake. The Free Hospital's annual report for 1903 listed her under deaths, advanced cases, little hope on admission. She had been classified as curable on admission. Her photograph appeared in the spring 1903 fundraising circular. Her name was changed to protect against embarrassment. The circular used a pseudonym. The accompanying text described her as a young working woman of Toronto, given her chance by your generosity. Her mother received a copy of the circular from a neighbor that May. She wrote a letter to the National Sanatorium Association. There is no surviving record of a reply. There was no apology. Robert Ashworth was 41 years old in the autumn of 1907 when he was admitted to the Muskoka Free Hospital. He had worked as a foundry laborer in Hamilton for 18 years. He had a wife and 4 children. He had developed tuberculosis, his physician believed, from the combination of foundry dust and the crowded conditions of the neighborhood where foundry workers lived, conditions that were, by 1907, well understood to be among the most significant accelerating factors in the disease's progress. He was a reader. His daughter described him, decades later in a letter to a public health researcher, as a man who read everything he could lay his hands on: newspapers, library books, whatever was available. He kept notes on what he read in a small notebook. The notebook survived him. He arrived at the Free Hospital in October. He was classified as early stage on the basis of an examination that, the surviving case notes suggest, lasted approximately 20 minutes. He was placed in the general ward and assigned to the veranda program. The October veranda program was tolerable. November was harder. By December, his case notes record progressive deterioration that the attending physician attributed to constitutional weakness, the era's term for a body that the medicine had decided could not be helped. The veranda regimen continued. He died on January 3rd, 1908. He was in the 4th month of a program that the institution's own literature promised could be completed in 6. His wife applied to the National Sanatorium Association for assistance with the funeral costs. The association's records show the application was declined. There was a form letter for this situation. His daughter, whose letter to a public health researcher in 1961 is one of the few surviving direct accounts of a Free Hospital patient's family experience, wrote, "He believed he was going somewhere that would give him a chance. He told us so the morning he left. I was 12 years old. I have never been entirely certain that it did." These 2 stories represent hundreds more. Many of those patients left no record outside the institution's case logs. Some of those logs have not survived. Many families never understood the discrepancy between what they were told and what the veranda delivered in January. They buried their people and attributed the loss to the disease. The institution attributed it to the disease too. The record of what happened at the Muskoka Free Hospital between 1900 and 1920 was not difficult to read for those with access to it, and access to it was carefully managed. The financial audit of 1909 was not the first internal document that raised questions the board preferred not to have raised publicly. Earlier correspondence between senior board members, held in the archives of Ontario, shows a sustained awareness of the gap between the Free Hospital's charitable mandate and its operational reality. The letters are careful. They use language that acknowledges the problem without naming it. Phrases like the allocation question, and the relative position of the two institutions, and ensuring the sustainability of the broader enterprise. No one receiving those letters needed the terms explained. The terms were being used precisely because they did not need explanation. The board members who wrote those letters were, outside those letters, prominent figures in Toronto's philanthropic landscape. They sat on hospital boards. They chaired church committees. They attended the annual dinners at which checks were presented to the causes they publicly supported. They were not unusual men. They were doing what men of their era in their position routinely did, managing a complex institutional reality in terms that kept the donors comfortable and the donations flowing. The chairman of the National Sanatorium Association's board, through the period of the 1909 audit, retired in 1918 with a dinner held in his honor at the National Club in Toronto. The Governor General sent a message of congratulation. The Globe ran a profile describing his philanthropic legacy. His name appears on a memorial plaque in a Toronto church that still stands. He was never asked about the 1909 audit in any public forum. He died in 1923. His papers are held at the Archives of Ontario. The folder containing the board correspondence from 1906 to 1912 is marked, in an archivist's pencil notation, restricted, personal correspondence. The public reckoning with what the Muskoka Free Hospital had been came slowly, partially, and was never completed. By the 1920s, the Ontario government had begun to take a more direct role in tuberculosis control, funding provincial sanatoria, establishing standards for patient care, and gradually assuming responsibility for the system that the National Sanatorium Association had built and run as a private charitable enterprise. The shift was driven in part by the scale of the TB crisis, which continued into the 1920s, and in part by a growing recognition in provincial public health circles that the charitable model had produced uneven results. The specific financial practices of the association, the redirection of free hospital donations, the gap between the published mission and the operational reality were never the subject of a formal public inquiry. Some former patients and their families began speaking in the 1930s and 1940s. As the sanatorium era receded, and streptomycin in 1943 finally provided an actual cure for tuberculosis. What they described, to journalists who occasionally wrote about the old sanatorium days, to the occasional oral historian who thought to ask, was consistent in its essential character. An institution that had told them one thing and done another. An institution that had used them. The formal historical record that exists in Ontario's archives, the board minutes, the annual reports, the financial documents, the case logs, tells a more fragmented version of the same story. Fragmented because some records did not survive. Fragmented because some records were never created. Fragmented because the institution's internal language had always been calibrated to describe what it wanted to be, rather than what it was. No former patient received compensation from the National Sanatorium Association or its successor institutions. No public apology was ever issued. The descendants of Clara Hodgson and Robert Ashworth, and the hundreds of patients like them, have never been told, in any official communication from any provincial or institutional body, that the institution's promise to their relatives was not kept, and that someone knew it was not being kept while it was still being made. The Muskoka Sanatorium Complex still exists in Gravenhurst, Ontario. It is now home to the Muskoka Algonquin Healthcare System, and, in part, to the Bethune Memorial House National Historic Site, commemorating Norman Bethune, who was himself a patient at the Muskoka Cottage Sanatorium in 1927, and whose experience there shaped his later career as a surgeon and medical reformer. The original free hospital pavilion no longer stands. It was demolished in the mid-20th century as the site underwent successive institutional repurposings. What remains of the original complex is a portion of the Cottage Sanatorium's main building, the structure that housed the paying patients, maintained with considerably better care, as it was always maintained with considerably better care. The lake is still there. The same lake. The same reflection doubling the sky in the early morning. The surrounding pine forest has filled back in around the developed portions of the site. In the summer, with the light on the water and the smell of the northern Ontario air coming in off the surface, it still looks exactly like what the fundraising circulars promised. Clean, restorative, like a place where you could get better. There is no plaque on the site naming the patients who died in the winter months. There is no memorial listing the names of those who were classified as curable when the evidence did not support that classification. There is no public acknowledgement, anywhere on the grounds or in any provincial communication, that funds raised for the poorest and most vulnerable patients in the institution's care were redirected to other purposes, without the knowledge of the donors who provided them. The Bethune Memorial House tells the story of one patient who survived Muskoka and went on to change the world. The patients who did not survive Muskoka have no memorial. There are two Muskoka free hospitals. The first was the institution that William Gage founded, and that the early fundraising literature described, a genuine attempt to bring the most advanced medical thinking of the era to the poor consumptives of Ontario, to give them the same chance at recovery that private sanatoria were offering the wealthy. It was imperfect. It was limited by money and by the genuine constraints of operating a charitable institution in a province that had not yet committed public funds to tuberculosis care. But it was, in its founding intention, an act of humanitarian ambition. The second Muskoka Free Hospital was the institution that existed from roughly 1905 onward, the one in which dying patients were photographed without family consent, and their images used to raise money for an institution whose finances did not work the way it told its donors they did, in which the scientific evidence for the veranda regimen in Canadian winters was known to be thinner than the annual reports acknowledged, in which the men who ran the institution protected the institution's revenue model above the interests of the people the institution existed to serve. The worst the first free hospital did was make promises it could not keep, because medicine had not yet provided the tools to keep them. The worst the second did was know that those promises were not being kept, and make them again anyway, in print, every spring, with a photograph of someone's daughter on the cover. Both institutions had the same verandas. Both had the same lake. Both called what they did a free chance to live. The unanswered questions remain. How many patients died on the Muskoka Free Hospital's open-air verandas in the winter months from causes that the institution's own literature acknowledged as related to the regimen? The number is in the case logs. The logs are in the archives. They have not been systematically analyzed. How much money raised in the name of the free hospital's indigent patients was redirected to other purposes between 1900 and 1920? The 1909 audit documents one instance. What the full period of the institutional accounts would show has never been established by any independent review. What happened to the families who wrote to the National Sanitarium Association asking questions about care, about deaths, about the photographs in the circulars? The surviving correspondence is one-sided. The association's replies have largely not been preserved, or were not kept, or were never written. Will there ever be a formal acknowledgement from any institutional or provincial body that the free hospital's practices diverged from its stated mission in ways that caused harm to the people it claimed to be serving? The lake is still there. The pine forest is still there. The veranda of the original free hospital pavilion is gone. The pavilion was demolished and the material dispersed. But the orientation of the site is unchanged, and if you stand where it stood and look north across the water, the view is what it was in February 1903, when Clara Hodgson turned her face toward it for the last time. The fundraising circulars described this view as the view of recovery, the view of the life that waited on the other side of the cure. For the patients who arrived in November, who had waited 11 months on the charity list and arrived advanced and were classified as curable because the institution needed them to be, the lake was not the view of recovery. The verandas are gone. The institution's promise is still on the record, and somewhere in a folder in the archives of Ontario, marked in pencil, restricted, personal correspondence, is the evidence of who knew the difference between those two things, and chose the circular anyway. Did any of them ever ask what Clara's mother did with the pamphlet when the neighbor brought it to her door?